I'd been living alone for the past few years, and the quiet of my home was something I'd grown to appreciate. At 47, I wasn't exactly looking for excitement, but there were days when the mundane seemed a little too, mundane. That afternoon was one of those days. My faucet had been leaking for a while, and it had finally reached the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I picked up the phone and dialed the number of a local plumber I'd heard about. The kind of plumber who could get the job done without much fuss. I wasn't expecting much, maybe just a quick fix and a hefty bill. But when the doorbell rang an hour later, I was caught off guard. Standing there in the doorway was a man I wasn't prepared to see. His name was Jack, the plumber guy. And the first thing I noticed was his presence. He wasn't just any guy. He was different. His broad shoulders filled the doorway as he stepped inside, his movements confident and purposeful. He had this air about him that immediately commanded attention. His muscular build was hard to miss, strong arms and a chest that was, impressive to say the least. But it was more than just the muscles. It was the way he carried himself, the way he looked at me with those deep blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my face. I must have stared for a second longer than was polite because he raised an eyebrow, offering me a small, almost amused smile. "Something wrong, ma'am?" he asked, his voice warm and confident, as if he already knew exactly what I was thinking. I shook my head, suddenly embarrassed. "No, just wasn't expecting you to look, like that." I couldn't help myself. He had this rugged charm that was impossible to ignore. It was like something out of a dream, or maybe a movie. I didn't expect a plumber to make my heart skip a beat. But here he was, standing in front of me, and I felt this rush of something unfamiliar, something I hadn't felt in a long time. As Jack got to work on the sink, I tried to keep my composure, but I couldn't help but watch him. I tried not to stare, but it was like I couldn't pull my eyes away. The way his muscles flexed as he worked, the way his shirt clung to his back as he bent down to adjust the pipes. I found myself fascinated by it all. It wasn't just his physicality that got to me, though. There was something in the way he moved, in the quiet confidence he exuded, that made me feel something more. I wasn't sure if it was just a fleeting attraction or something deeper, but the moment he looked up and caught me watching him, I felt a jolt. He didn't seem uncomfortable. If anything, his smirk told me he was enjoying the attention. I forced myself to look away, trying to focus on something else. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I didn't want to feel this way. I was a grown woman, a professional with responsibilities, and a life that was solidly built. But there was something about Jack, something that pulled me in like a magnet. I hadn't felt an attraction like this in years, and it wasn't just a physical attraction. It was a pull, something emotional, something that stirred inside me and made my pulse race. Jack finished the job quickly and efficiently. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned to me with that same confident smile. "All set, ma'am. You shouldn't have any more leaks." He made it sound so easy, as if his mere presence was enough to fix anything. I thanked him, trying to keep my composure. "Thanks, Jack. You've been a huge help." "No problem," he said, flashing me a grin. "You take care now." He left, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him walk down the steps. And as he drove away, I felt a strange mix of disappointment and longing. I knew I shouldn't be thinking about him like this. He was just a plumber after all. But I couldn't help it. The way he had looked at me, the way he'd carried himself, it had all left an impression that was impossible to ignore. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I'd be thinking about Jack for a long time. It had been a full week since Jack had come by to fix the sink, and in all honesty, I couldn't get him out of my head. Every time I walked into my kitchen, I could almost feel his presence there, lingering in the air like some irresistible unspoken promise. I'd catch myself wondering about him, his laugh, his smile, the way his muscular arms flexed when he worked. I tried to shake it off as nothing more than a fleeting moment of attraction, but the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. It wasn't just his looks that drew me in, though. There was something about the way he carried himself, his quiet confidence, the warmth in his voice, even the way he interacted with the world. It all had a magnetic pull I couldn't quite explain. I never expected someone like him to pop into my life, especially not at this point. At 47, I was well past the stage of fumbling through unexpected crushes. But Jack was different. He wasn't just some random guy. I didn't know why, but it felt like he was someone I was meant to meet, even if just for this brief moment in time. So, when I found myself picking up the phone again to schedule him for the follow-up, I knew I was treading dangerous ground. I could tell myself all I wanted, that it was strictly professional, that I just needed the job done right. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted to see him again. When Jack showed up that afternoon, I tried to keep my composure. He knocked at the door, his usual smile in place, and I felt my heart do something unexpected. Flutter. He was dressed in his usual work gear, but it didn't take much for my mind to wander. I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt clung to his body, outlining his broad chest and shoulders. His jeans fit just right, a little worn but perfectly comfortable, and I couldn't help but trace the muscles in his arms as he greeted me with that same warm smile. I told myself to snap out of it, but the truth was the attraction had only grown stronger. We exchanged small talk about the plumbing job, but I could barely focus on the conversation. My thoughts were running wild, my pulse quickening with each passing second. The chemistry between us, the unspoken tension, seemed to pulse in the air between us. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper, something that I hadn't felt in years. At one point, our eyes met across the room, and for a second, I saw something there. A flicker, a spark, something that told me Jack might feel it too. It made me uneasy and excited all at once, like I was stepping into uncharted territory. He shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of him looking at me, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long. It wasn't the kind of look you gave someone by accident. It was intentional. And then, suddenly, without warning, the words just slipped out of my mouth. I didn't plan on saying anything, but before I could think twice, I blurted, "I've been thinking about you, Jack, since the last time you were here." It was out there, and I didn't know how to take it back. I hadn't even fully processed it myself. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but there was a weight in my chest that felt both terrifying and liberating. Jack stood there for a moment, completely still, his eyes wide. I half expected him to brush it off, laugh, maybe even backpedal, but instead he looked at me with a deep, piercing gaze, his face softening just slightly. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as he opened his mouth to speak, and then he said something I hadn't anticipated. "I've been thinking about you too, Emily," he confessed, his voice low, steady. "I didn't know if it was just me, or if you felt it, but I can't stop thinking about you either." The words hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel my breath catch, the weight of what he'd just said settling into the space between us. I wanted to say something, but my mind was racing, unsure of where this was headed or if I was ready for what was to come. But the moment lingered, and neither of us seemed in any rush to move away from it. Jack took a step closer, closing the gap between us, his presence overpowering in the best way. His hand reached out, as if he was unsure but also certain, and my body betrayed me as I stepped toward him. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly his lips were on mine, warm and urgent, as if everything we'd been feeling had built up to this one moment. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw, passionate, and everything I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. All I knew was that in that moment, it was as though everything else faded away. There was only him, and the unspoken truth between us, thick and undeniable. After the kiss, I was left standing there, my heart pounding in my chest, my head spinning with 1,000 thoughts. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. 1 minute, everything felt normal. Just another quiet afternoon with a plumber fixing a sink. And the next, Jack and I had crossed a line I hadn't even known was there. My lips still tingled from the kiss, and I could feel the warmth of his hands lingering on my skin, as though he was still touching me even though he had stepped back. I couldn't stop thinking about how natural it had felt. The way our bodies seemed to fit together, the way our lips moved in sync. It was as if everything had led to this. But then the reality hit me like a bucket of cold water. What the hell had I just done? I was a grown woman, Someone who had lived through enough life to know better than to get caught up in something like this. He was younger than me, almost a decade younger. And yet, the attraction was so strong that it seemed to defy any kind of rational thought. I tried to step back, to put some distance between us, but it felt impossible. I knew I couldn't ignore what had just happened. What did this mean? Was this just a momentary lapse in judgment? Or was it something more? What if I had made a huge mistake? Jack seemed equally lost in the same whirlwind of emotions. His face was flushed, his eyes dark with desire. But there was also something else there. Something I couldn't quite place. He wasn't just looking at me like he wanted something physical. There was a deeper yearning in his eyes, something about the way he seemed almost vulnerable, as if this moment had shaken him just as much as it had shaken me. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "I didn't plan for this," he said, his tone a mix of honesty and uncertainty. "I don't know what's happening here, but I can't pretend it's not real." His words hit me like a punch in the stomach. I had been hoping for some kind of clarity, some sign that this was just a passing thing, but his confession only made everything feel more complicated. I could feel my own emotions swirling, unsure of whether I was thrilled or terrified. Part of me wanted to push him away, to put an end to this madness before it spiraled out of control. But another part of me, one that I didn't even recognize anymore, wanted to pull him back in, to keep kissing him, to keep exploring whatever this was between us. But then, like a cruel twist of fate, another thought surfaced, one that I couldn't ignore. Jack wasn't just some random guy. He wasn't just the plumber who had come to fix a sink. I knew his mother, Diane, and I knew she was someone I considered a friend, someone I had known for years. The weight of that reality hit me hard. What was I doing? How could I keep going down this path when it could destroy everything I had built with Diane? What if she found out? Jack seemed to sense the shift in my energy, the way I pulled away from him, as if I was suddenly second-guessing everything. He took a step back, his brow furrowed with concern. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel it, Emily. I can't just ignore this." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the confusion that was swirling inside me? How could I tell him that this moment felt like it was both everything I wanted and everything I feared? Instead, I just shook my head, my eyes avoiding his. "We can't. Jack, this isn't right. You're Diane's son." I knew that was the heart of the issue. Diane had been my friend for years. We had shared so many moments, so many pieces of our lives. She was someone I trusted. I couldn't betray her like this. Jack's face softened, and I could see the conflict there. He wasn't blind to the situation we were in. But he didn't pull away completely. Instead, he reached out, his hand gently brushing my arm. "I know it's complicated," he said, his voice low. "But I can't ignore how I feel either. It's real, Emily." The air between us was thick with tension, and all I wanted to do was leave the room, to escape from the overwhelming weight of it all. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the connection, the pull between us. And at that moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to run or lean in closer. But the reality of what we had done settled heavily on my chest. I knew this couldn't end here. Whatever this was, it had consequences. And I wasn't sure I was ready to face them. The tension between Jack and me was palpable, hanging thick in the air like a storm cloud that was about to burst. We barely spoke for the next few days, both of us wrestling with what had happened. I was consumed with guilt and confusion, unsure of where to go from here. But at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want to let go of whatever this was between us. And then, everything changed in an instant. It was a Saturday afternoon when Diane, Jack's mother, and my best friend, dropped by unannounced as she often did. I was in the middle of tidying up my kitchen, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling around in my mind, when I heard the knock at the door. Diane had a habit of popping in without warning, and despite everything that had been building between Jack and me, I was still happy to see her. We'd known each other for years, and she was a constant in my life, a woman I trusted, someone who had always been there. When I opened the door, Diane's usual bright smile greeted me, and I could feel myself relax. even though I knew I wasn't quite myself. She stepped inside with a quick hug and an easy laugh, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "Hey, I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you," she said, tossing her bag onto the chair. "How have you been?" I gave her a tight smile and led her into the living room. She perched herself on the couch, and we began chatting about the usual, her work, my day-to-day life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The conversation felt strangely distant, as though a wall had come up between us, though neither of us had said anything to put it there. But then, completely out of the blue, Diane said something that stopped me cold. "You know," she said casually, "Jack's really been growing up lately. He's not the boy I raised anymore. It's nice to see him so self-assured. It's kind of hard to ignore how handsome he's become. I guess I never really saw it before." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I froze, unable to move or speak for a long moment. Was she talking about her own son this way? I could feel the blood drain from my face as I processed what she'd just said. Diane had always been open and honest, but hearing her speak about Jack in that way, it was as if she had crossed an invisible line. I had thought I was the only one who had been feeling this strange pull toward him. I had told myself that this was something I shouldn't entertain, that the attraction was just a passing moment, something that would fade. But hearing her voice her own feelings for him, unaware of the storm brewing between Jack and me, shattered whatever semblance of control I had left. "Diane," I managed to choke out, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean by that? You're talking about your son." She looked at me as if I'd just asked the most obvious question in the world. "Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but he's definitely growing into a man, you know. There's something about him now, more than before." My chest tightened. It was as if I had heard everything backward. I thought it was just me, this deep, uncomfortable attraction. But now Diane had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Was I the only one struggling with this? Was it something we both shared? This impossible attraction to a man who was both off limits and yet so undeniably captivating? I could feel the air growing thick around me. It was like the room had shrunk, the walls closing in as I tried to process the weight of Diane's words. What was I supposed to say to her? How could I confess my own feelings without destroying everything? "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Diane added, suddenly aware of my silence. He's my son, and I never really noticed how..." She trailed off, as if she was realizing for the first time just how awkward her admission had been. But the damage was done. I stood up, my legs shaky as the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. "I think I need some air," I muttered, trying to push past the overwhelming feeling that was suffocating me. Diane's expression softened, but she didn't push. "Yeah, sure. Take a minute. We can talk later." I left the room quickly, retreating to the backyard, where I stood in the cool air, trying to ground myself. My mind was spinning. Diane had unknowingly just laid bare the very thing I was trying to bury deep down. She had feelings for her son, just as I had for him. And now, everything I thought I knew about my own emotions was called into question. Could I even trust myself anymore? How could I go on pretending that this was just some passing fantasy when it was clear that it was more than that? For both of us. As I stood there, the sound of my racing heart drowned out everything else. I didn't know how I was going to navigate this anymore. What had started as a simple attraction had already spiraled into something much darker and more complicated. And now I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The days after Diane's visit felt like they lasted an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling of everything unraveling around me, like I was stuck in some kind of tangled web that I didn't know how to escape. Every time I saw Jack, which was more often than I would have liked, it felt like the space between us was charged, alive with something unsaid, something that neither of us could ignore anymore. It wasn't just the guilt anymore, although that was still there, lurking in the background. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his eyes would linger a little too long, the subtle heat in his gaze that made my skin burn. It was the touches, small and fleeting, but impossible to miss. A hand brushing against my arm when we passed each other, his fingers grazing my back when he leaned in to speak close. Every moment felt loaded, as if we were both on the edge of something that could either destroy us or set us free. I knew deep down that this was wrong. He was Jack, my best friend's son. He was too young, too close to everything that mattered to me. But every time he smiled, every time his voice softened as he spoke to me, all those thoughts flew out of my mind. He was the only thing that felt real anymore. The only thing that could make me forget the chaos swirling in my life. We shared stolen moments like that, when no one else was around to see, when the world outside seemed to fade away. There were times when we were alone in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, and he would stand just a little too close. His scent, fresh and musky, would fill my senses, and I'd find myself fighting the urge to lean in, to close the distance between us. And he would watch me, as if he could see everything I was thinking, as if he knew the battle I was waging inside myself. It wasn't just physical anymore. I could feel it, this pull between us that went beyond desire. There were moments when we would talk, and it felt like we were the only two people in the world. He would listen to me in a way that no one else did, like every word I said mattered to him, like I was the most important person in his life. And I couldn't deny that it made me feel something deep and dangerous. But there was always that nagging voice in the back of my head. Diane, my best friend, the woman I had known for years, the one who had trusted me, confided in me, and now I was starting to question whether I could even trust myself. Could I look her in the eye and tell her what was happening between Jack and me? Could I live with the consequences of betraying her trust? The guilt was suffocating, but so was the desire. And Jack too was fighting his own battle. I saw it in the way he would pull away sometimes, as if he was afraid of what we were becoming. But then, just when I thought he was retreating, he would find some reason to be near me again, his touch lingering, his eyes burning with that same heat. Each time we shared a moment like that, each time I felt his presence so close to mine, the tension would build higher and higher. It was like a dam that was about to break, and I had no idea what would happen once it did. Would I be able to stop? Could I walk away from this before it ruined everything? Or was I already too deep in it? I couldn't tell. But what I knew for sure was that I couldn't escape him, and I couldn't escape myself. Our desires were entwined now, and every stolen glance, every heated breath, only made it harder to walk away. This wasn't just a passing attraction anymore. It had become something darker, something more dangerous, and I wasn't sure where it would end. And then there was Diane. She was still there, in the background, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing between her son and me. She was still my best friend, the one person I had trusted with my life, but every time I saw her, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the secret we were both hiding. I could no longer look at her without feeling like I was betraying her. But the worst part, the part that haunted me the most, was that part of me didn't want it to stop. I didn't want this tension between Jack and me to fade away. I wanted more. I needed more. And the more I tried to deny it, the stronger it became. We were both trapped in a game we couldn't win. It happened on a quiet afternoon, when the weight of everything, our stolen moments, the guilt, the undeniable chemistry, became too much to ignore. Jack came over to check on some maintenance around the house, and as soon as he walked through the door, I could feel the tension in the air. It was thick, almost suffocating, hanging between us like a secret neither of us could keep anymore. We exchanged a few words, nothing out of the ordinary, but I could tell we both knew that this was it. The moment we had been avoiding, the one where everything would come crashing down. My heart was racing, my palms sweating as I tried to make sense of what had been happening between us. I had known it was coming, but I had no idea how to handle it. What do you do when the feelings you've been hiding have become so real, so undeniable? Then, just as I was about to say something, anything, to break the silence, I heard the front door open. Diane's voice rang out, cheerful and oblivious as she stepped inside. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Jack looked at me, his face a mask of surprise and confusion, and then there it was, an unbearable silence. Diane came around the corner, smiling, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the room. "Hey, you two. What's going on?" she asked, glancing back and forth between us. It was as if time slowed down. I could see the look in Jack's eyes, the way he tried to mask the panic in his expression, but it was too late. The truth was out there, hanging between us like a confession we couldn't take back. For a moment, no one spoke. Diane stood there, her smile faltering slightly as she noticed the strange energy in the room. Jack shifted his weight uncomfortably, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the shame, the fear of being exposed. It was like everything I had been trying to keep hidden had suddenly been laid bare in front of the one person who had no idea about any of it. I tried to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat. What was I supposed to say? How could I explain the mess I had made? The attraction I had tried to ignore, the lines I had crossed without even realizing it? How could I tell Diane, my best friend, that her son had become the one thing I couldn't let go of? The one thing I couldn't fight anymore? Jack took a step toward me, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. It was just him and me, standing there in the silence, with Diane just a few feet away. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, I saw the look on his face, the raw emotion that he couldn't hide any longer. He knew we couldn't pretend anymore. Neither of us could. Jack started, but his voice cracked. "I have to tell you something," he said, looking at me. And then, with a deep breath, he turned to Diane, his mother, and said the words that I had been dreading to hear. "I've been feeling something for Emily. I can't deny it anymore." I felt my world tilt on its axis. Diane's face paled, and she took a step back, as if she had been slapped. I could see the shock on her face, the disbelief, and the pain. She was looking at both of us now, and I could feel her eyes burning into me, demanding answers. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind spinning, and I had no idea how to fix this. Everything I had been trying to protect, my relationship with Diane, the friendship we had built over the years, was unraveling in front of me. There was no going back. There was no undoing what had already been said. We were at the breaking point now, and all I could do was wait for the fallout. Diane didn't speak right away. She just stood there, her face a mixture of hurt and confusion. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. And in that moment, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. I looked at Jack, and I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just confessing to Diane. He was confessing to me too, admitting what we both knew but had been too afraid to face. He didn't have the answers, and neither did I. But we couldn't walk away from what we had started, no matter how much we wanted to. "I'm sorry," Diane whispered finally, her voice barely audible, as she turned and walked out of the room. The door slammed behind her, and it felt like the final nail in the coffin. Jack and I stood there alone again, in the silence that followed. And I realized that whatever came next, it would be a path we would have to walk together, whether we were ready for it or not.